Bueno, pues muy buenas tardes tengan todos. Muy buenas tardes allá en Roma al profesor Casali. Un segundo. Listo. Bueno, pues es para mí un gusto, ¿no? Un honor inaugurar este ciclo internacional de conferencias que tendremos durante las próximas semanas en nuestro Seminario de Estudios sobre historia de la poesía griega y latina. Y en esta ocasión contamos con la presencia de uno de los más importantes especialistas en el mundo en el ámbito de la poesía latina, el profesor Sergio Casali, que nos presentará un trabajo titulado The Books of Fate, The Venus-Jupiter Scene in Metamorphoses 15 and its Epic Models. La dinámica de la sesión va a ser la siguiente. Esperen un minuto, déjenme poner como co-host a Néstor para que me ayude con la gente que se va metiendo a la sesión. Ya está. Entonces, bueno, les decía que la dinámica de la sesión va a ser la siguiente. Primero el profesor Baruch nos presentará al profesor Casali, que fue su maestro y mentor en el doctorado en Roma. Después el profesor Casali presentará su trabajo y después tendremos un turno de preguntas. Vamos a privilegiar la participación de los miembros del seminario y si hay alguien que quiera expresar su pregunta por escrito, aquí en el chat puede hacerlo. Y bueno, las preguntas pueden hacerlas en inglés o en italiano, y si alguno la quiere hacer en español, aquí contamos con colegas, Baruch o Vicente, que pueden traducir la pregunta al italiano y otros que pueden hacerlo al inglés. Bueno, sin más por mi parte, le cedo la palabra al profesor Baruch, no sin antes agradecer al profesor Casali por estar aquí y por aver accettato nuestra invitazione. Ringraziamo il professore Casali di questo bellissimo lavoro che ha condiviso con noi e ora possiamo passare alla presentazione a carico del professore Baruch. Grazie.
Buenas tardes a todos. Para nosotros un verdadero honor tener aquí al profesor Sergio Casali. El profesor Sergio Casali no tiene necesidad de presentaciones. Es profesor de lengua y literatura latina en la Università degli Studi di Roma Vergata. Es especialista en poesía augustea, Virgilio y Ovidio. Sobre dichos temas ha publicado más de 60 artículos en las principales revistas internacionales, entre las cuales The Classical Quarterly, Harvard Studies in Classical Philology, Proceedings of the Cambridge Philological Society, Transactions of the American Philological Society, Philologus y Materiali e Discussioni. Y en sedes como Oxford Readings in Ovid, Oxford 2006, The Cambridge Companion to the Writings of Julius Caesar, Cambridge 2018, y The Cambridge Companion to Virgil, Second Edition, Cambridge 2019. Su libro más reciente, Virgilio Neide 2, Introduzione, Traduzione e Commento a cura di Sergio Casali, Pisa, Edizioni della Normale 2017, ha sido galardonado el año pasado con el Alexander J. Mackay Prize for Virgilian Studies de la Virgilian Society. Actualmente está trabajando en un comentario libro cuarto de la Eneida para la colección Cambridge Greek and Latin Classics de Cambridge University Press. Ha dictado conferencias y ha sido invitado a congresos en diversas universidades italianas y extranjeras, entre las cuales Harvard, Columbia, Virginia, Cambridge, Oxford, Wisconsin, Colorado, Bristol, Institute of Classical Studies en Londres, Trinity College en Dublín, Manchester, University of California, Los Angeles, Pennsylvania, Scuola Normale di Pisa, Princeton, Brown, the College of William and Mary. Además de lo anterior, es miembro del comité científico de la revista Vergilius en Estados Unidos y dictaminador de Oxford University Press y University of Michigan Press y de diversas revistas italianas e internacionales, entre las cuales Harvard Studies in Classical Philology, American Journal of Philology, Transactions of the American Philological Association, Materiali e Discussioni, Phoenix Maya, Rivista di Cultura Classica e Medievale, Vergilius, Acta Classica, Evum Antiquum, Rivista di Filologia e Istruzione Classica, Nemosine, Eufrosine, Latomiu, entre otras. Sin más, cedo la palabra al profesor Sergio Casali. Prego, profesor.
Grazie Baruch, ringrazio appunto i miei ospiti, il professor Bernardo Berruecos Frank e il mio amico Baruch Martinez Cepeda, professor Martinez Cepeda, che ringrazio per questa presentazione. E per me è un piacere e un onore essere vostro ospite e queste sono le sole parole che dirò in italiano. Adesso penso sia più facile per voi seguire il discorso se parlerò in inglese. Del resto dovreste avere il testo del mio talk sotto gli occhi, quindi spero che possiate seguire bene. When Venus at the same time understands that in order for the future Augustus not to be born of mortal seed, it is necessary for Caesar to be made a god, and sees that a grim death is being prepared for him by the weapons of the conspirators, grows pale and starts lamenting with every god she meets, asking them to thwart that murderous attempt. But the gods, though moved by her words, cannot break the iron decrees of the ancient sisters. The Parcae, rumpere ferrea non possunt, veterum decreta sororum, Metamorphoses 15, 780-81, and limit themselves to manifest their grieving with a series of horrendous omens. Then at 803-6, Venus meditates of hiding Caesar in a cloud and snatching him from death, as once she had done with Paris in Iliad 3 and with Aeneas in Iliad 5. And you find the relevant text at number 1 in your handout if you have it. Then in truth, I read the translation. Then in truth, Venus struck her breast with both hands and tries to hide the descendant of Aeneas in the same cloud in which she once had snatched away Paris from the attack of the son of Atreus, and Aeneas had escaped Diomedes' sword. Jupiter intervenes and asks her if she alone intends to move unconquerable fate. Caesar's destiny is written in the tabularia of the Parcae and can be read by herself if she goes there. He himself had read and memorized it, and now he will recount it to her. Lines 807-15. Thus the father spoke, "Alone, daughter, do you prepare to move unconquerable fate? You are allowed yourself to enter the dwelling of the three sisters. There you will see, with their massive structure, the archives of the world made of bronze and solid iron, which fear neither the crashing of the sky nor the anger of the lightning bolt or any destruction, being safe and eternal. There you will find the fates of your descendants engraved on everlasting adamant. I read them myself and noted them in my mind, and will relate, lest you be even now unknowing of the future." The primary model from this scene is clearly the dialogue between Jupiter and Venus in Aeneid 1, as we shall see. That this sequence, not by chance introduced by two Homeric references, also alludes to the sequence at Iliad 16, 431-57, the dialogue between Zeus and Hera about the impending death of Sarpedon. There, it is Zeus himself who sees that death is approaching his son Sarpedon, and it is him who meditates on snatching him from death. Iliad 16, 433-8. Alas, for that it is fated that Sarpedon, whom I love more than any man, be killed by Patroclus, son of Menecius. And my heart is divided in two, as I meditate in my thought, whether I shall snatch him up while he is still alive, and set him down in the rich land of Lycia, far from the tearful war, or whether I shall slay him now under the hands of the son of Menecius. The first word Jupiter addresses to Venus, sola, on your own, all by yourself, but also you alone, has multiple ironic resonances and is a witty reminder of the long series of precedents for the scene to follow. And she is surely not alone in wanting to move unconquerable fate, if we only remember Juno's repeated attempt to subvert fate in the Aeneid. She is also definitely not alone, specifically in wanting to snatch a divine son from fated death. Jupiter, Zeus himself, had had the same thought in Iliad 16, and there too he was prevented to act in favor of his son by the intervention of another divinity, Hera, who reminded him of the inevitability of fate for mortals. Iliad 16, 440-49. What the Homeric Hera suggested Zeus to do was to leave Sarpedon die, and then, as soon as breath and life had abandoned him, to send Thanatos and Hypnos to seize his body and bring it to Lycia, where it would have been honored with funeral rites by his brothers and comrades. This is the model for Jupiter's instructions to Venus. She should leave Caesar die and then seize his soul and change it into a star. Metamorphoses 15, 840-42. Meanwhile, snatch his soul from his murdered body and make a star out of it, so that the deified Julius may always look down from his lofty dwelling on our Capitol and Forum. True, Venus's intervention as suggested by Jupiter is much more invasive and radical than that suggested by Hera to Zeus in Iliad 16. Venus is ordered to create a new star, while Zeus was simply allowed to transport a dead body to its fatherland. But the sequence, A divine parent meditates to snatch his or her son from death, B is reminded by another god or goddess of the inevitability of fate, and C is allowed to do at least something to alleviate his or her grief after the death of the son, is clearly the same in Homer as in Ovid. The Homeric Zeus evidently has, at least in this passage, the power of subverting fate, since Hera considers as a possibility that he may in fact choose to save Sarpedon. The only problem would be the angry reaction of all the other gods, even if that very reaction, as prospected by Hera, means that Zeus at least is not expected to do things contrary to fate. Anyway, the god learned his lesson. In the adaptation of the Zeus-Hera scene of Iliad 16 at Aeneid 10, 464-73, it is Jupiter who plays the role of the Homeric Hera, reminding Hercules of the inevitability of fate, even by self-reflexively using the very example of Sarpedon's death. While Jupiter's words do not explicitly clarify anything about the relationship between Jupiter's will and fate, the context clearly suggests that Virgil is hinting here at the notion of Jupiter's will as subordinated to fate. Here there is not even question of subverting Pallas's destiny of death. Hercules, differently from Zeus in Iliad 16, is not meditating or saving Pallas, but is just mourning his impending death, and the possibility that Jupiter saves Pallas is not contemplated, while the god concludes his speech by saying that etiam sua turnum fata vocant, metasque dati pervenit ad aevi, 471-72. Turnus too is called by his fates and has come to the end of the lifetime that has been given to him. It is difficult not to feel that here Jupiter attributes the inevitability of death for mortals to something different from his own will. However, this contrasts with other passages of the Aeneid, which clearly imply, as we shall see, an identification of fate with Jupiter's will. And after all, in this very passage of Aeneid 10, Virgil is ambiguous. Could Jupiter have saved Pallas? The fact that this possibility is not hinted at in his speech does not necessarily mean that it would be impossible for Jupiter to prevent Pallas's death. Perhaps what is understood is that he can prevent Pallas's death, but chooses not to do that for the same reasons expounded by the Homeric Hera. Or perhaps what is understood is that he really cannot subvert the will of fate. The incoherencies of Virgil's theology reflect and reproduce the incoherencies of Homer's theology. It is not a coincidence if the critics of Homer and those of Virgil often share the same vocabulary and the same expressions when speaking of the difficult problem of the relationship of Zeus, Jupiter, with fate. Is Zeus subject to fate? Is the mortal Moira identical with Zeus's will? Virgil decides to reproduce Homer's incoherence. Ovid simplifies and brings order to Virgil's confusion. It is crystal clear that his Jupiter is subordinate to the decision of fate, and it is equally clear that this position of Ovid is meant to be read as a comment on Virgil's bewildering confusion in this matter. Let's approach this issue, this time starting from the influence of the dialogue between Venus and Jupiter in Aeneid 1 on the Venus-Jupiter scene in Metamorphoses 15. Ovid reworks at the same time the Zeus-Hera scene in Iliad 16, and through it Virgil's adaptation of it in Aeneid 10, and the Venus-Jupiter scene in Aeneid 1. From the first contest come both Venus's project of Homerically snatching away Caesar from impending death, and Jupiter's concession to her of at least something, that is, the possibility of making a star out of his soul. From the second, the bulk of Jupiter's speech, with the prophecy about Augustus's future greatness, which corresponds to the Roman and Augustan prophecy of Virgil's Jupiter. Jupiter's words at the beginning of his speech to Venus, sola insuperabile fatum nata movere paras 807-8, obviously echo those addressed by the god to Venus at the beginning of his prophetic speech in Aeneid 1. Parce metu cuterea manenti mota tuorum fata tibi, spare yourself these fears, Cytherea, The destinies of your descendants remain unchanged. In both contexts, the point revolves around the inevitability of fate. But in Aeneid 1, the problem is that Venus fears that the destinies of her descendants might have changed, and Jupiter reassures her that everything will go according to his old promises. In Ovid, instead, Venus wants to change the fate of her descendant Caesar by saving him from being killed, while Jupiter admonishes her that his fate is immovable. Also here, a major irony is that in this very moment and with these very words, Ovid too is changing the fate of Caesar by inventing the notion of the fated inevitability of his death, and by creating this kind of divine charade around the events surrounding it. Another marker of Ovid's repetition of the Aeneid 1 scene is Kernes at Metamorphoses 15:809. Kernes illic molimine vasto exeret solidore rum tabularia ferro. Kernes is a most evident signal that Jupiter is reworking his prophecy of Aeneid 1. The verb occurs in the same metrical position at Aeneid 1, 258:9. Kernes urbem et promissa Lavini Moenia. You will see the city and the promised wars of Lavinium. The only two occurrences of this word in this metrical position in both the Aeneid and the Metamorphoses. In the Aeneid, Kernes is a direct part of Jupiter's own prophecy. He predicts that Venus will see Lavinium as promised. In the Metamorphoses, Kernes is no longer part of Jupiter's prophecy. The god only says that if Venus enters the house of the Parcae, she will see the tablet containing the fates of her descendants. This highlights the fact that in Metamorphoses 15, Jupiter, while quoting his Virgilian prophecy, is no longer actually prophesying. He has just memorized the prophecy contained in a tablet he has read in the house of the Parcae, and now he limits himself to repeat it to Venus. This brings us back to Ovid's clarification of the relationship between Jupiter and fate. In the Aeneid, there are two conflicting views of it. Sometimes Jupiter appears to be only a mouthpiece of fate. Most of the times, however, fate seems to be identified with Jupiter's will itself. It is not a chance that many distinguished Virgilianists wish to propose the second view as the official view of the Aeneid. As a matter of fact, the Venus-Jupiter scene in Aeneid 1 is one of the passages with which modern critics tend to use to support the idea of an identification of fate with Jupiter's will. Already Venus in her complaint refers to Jupiter's previous promises and opinion, so highlighting the importance of his will in deciding the destiny of the Trojans and of their descendants. 235, Pollicitus, quae te genitor sententia vertit, you promised, what opinion, father, has turned you? Though it is not altogether clear how this reference to Jupiter's will is to be combined with her weighting fates against opposed fates, fatis contraria fata rependens, 239, it seems impossible to understand here which idea of the relationship Jupiter-fate Venus has exactly in her mind. In his speech, however, Jupiter is apparently explicit in equating fate with his own will, as the etymological wordplay fabor fatorum would also seem to suggest. The future destiny of Aeneas and his descendants is presented as determined by what he thinks and does. Neque me sententia vertit, 260. His ego nec metas rerum nec tempora pono imperium sine fine dedi, 278-9. Sic placitum, 283. However, the very line containing the word fata, longius et volvens fatorum arcana movebo, notwithstanding the above-mentioned cluster fabor fatorum, creates a problem. Does movebo here mean I will steer up, implying that the course of future events is actually set in motion by Jupiter's words? Or does it mean I will reveal, relate, so potentially suggesting that Jupiter is here but a mere mouthpiece of the will of fate? Are fata here just the things Jupiter has said, or are they some power distinct from the god? The issue is even more interesting if we reflect on the implications of volvens, which suggests the unrolling of a scroll and then the reading of a book. Jupiter's words are ambiguous. Is he referring to a book of fate independent from his will, so Servius Danielis on Aeneid 10:8, or as the etymological wordplay fabor fatorum would seem to suggest, the book of fate contains his own very words? That ancient exegetis of the Aeneid read this line as implying the first alternative is very suggestive in front of Ovid's choice of developing the hint of writing in Jupiter's speech into an elaborate description of the tabularia written, evidently or anyway preserved by the Parcae, which he himself has read and memorized and which will now reveal to his daughter. I must skip now a section on Virgil's ancient exegesis, otherwise the talk would be too long. And what interests us about the comment of Servius and Servius Danielis on these Virgilian passages is the certain thesis that the idea that in the Aeneid there is no coincidence between Jupiter's will and the decrees of fate. We are now at page, at page 8, at the end of page 8. The ancient exegetes tend to underline the difference between fate and Jupiter's will, and this obviously means that they were well aware of the contradictoriness of Virgil's position about Jupiter and fate. See, for example, for an explicit declaration, Servius Danielis on Aeneid 8:398, which is number 9 in your handout and the end of page 8. We must notice that here he is commenting on Virgil's line, nec pater omnipotens Troiam nec fata vetabunt, and he says that we must notice that here it separates Jupiter from the fates, while elsewhere, he unites them, as at 375-6. Since there is no way of overlooking those passages which clearly do imply an identification of the two powers, and elsewhere Servius himself sustains this identification, and these are passages number 10 on your handout. Ovid, in front of this question, which is exactly the relationship between Jupiter and fate in the Aeneid, chooses to embrace the same view of the Sapientes cited by Servius Danielis on 10.8, that of a complete separation between Jupiter and fate. He does so in a typically exaggerated way, most clearly showing that he is developing a parody of a critical discourse on the Aeneid and its contradictions, and specifically on the self-contradictory prophecy of Jupiter in Aeneid 1. On the eve of the killing of Caesar, Ovid drastically and parodically simplifies Virgil's complexity and contradictoriness. If I have insisted on the reaction of the ancient exegetes to the problems posited by Jupiter and fate in the Aeneid, is because I think that we should be prepared to consider the possibility that Ovid himself is already reading an annotated Aeneid, so to speak, in which such questiones as the contradiction between different views on the Jupiter-fate relationship in the Aeneid are already part of the critical debate. Ovid provides clarity where Virgil had been obscure and complicated. In Ovid's view, the Parcae and not Jupiter are responsible for the destiny of the world. The Parcae are present also in the Aeneid, but their role there is wholly mysterious, and there is no way of locating them in a triangulation with Jupiter and fate. In the Metamorphoses, instead, the role of the Parcae as a power superior to that of Jupiter is maintained through the whole poem. At Metamorphoses 532, the first and only occurrence of the name of the Parcae in the poem appears in Jupiter's mouth. Ceres asked Jupiter of allowing Proserpina to come back to the world of the living. The god, after saying that after all Pluto is really in love with her daughter, and that in any case he would not be an unworthy husband for her, if Ceres really wants to part, then Proserpina will reach the sky again, but only if the underworld she has touched no food. Nam sic parcarum foedere cautum est. For such is the rule decreed by the Parcae. Number 11 on the handout, Metamorphoses 532. Ceres is determined to win her daughter back, but non ita fata sinunt, 534. Fate does not allow that, because she has eaten 7 seeds from a pomegranate. Already in this passage, then, the subordination of Jupiter's will to the decrees of the Parcae is clear. Ovid is explicit and coherent on this matter. Ovid's vision of the relationship between Jupiter and fate is confirmed by the passage in Book 1 where Jupiter is about to blast mankind with thunderbolts, but suddenly remembers that it was fated that someday the universe would have collapsed, devoured by a cosmic conflagration. Metamorphoses 1, 253, 8, number 12a, where it's Metamorphoses 1, not 10, 12a in the handout, Metamorphoses 1, 253, 8. And he was already ready to scatter lightning bolts all over the earth, but he feared that the sacred ether might be ignited by so many fires and that the long axis of the world might burn. He also remembers that fate had decreed that there would have come a time when sea, land, and the royal palace of the sky would be seized by fire and burn, and the industrious structure of the universe would be in distress. There is a witty irony here. In a passage where Ovid most clearly affirms Jupiter's independence from fate, what the god suddenly remembers is the Stoic doctrine of the final ekpyrosis. Of course, however, always according to mainstream Stoic doctrine, Jupiter is to be identified with fate. See, for example, Cicero, De Natura Deorum 140, number 12b in your handout. He is, that is, Chrysippus, also states that the power of an enduring and eternal law, which he calls the guide of life and mentor in our duties, is Jupiter, and he calls that law, or him, the necessity of fate, the enduring truth of future events. What Ovid presents here is a contradiction in terms. It is a profoundly unstoic Jupiter who remembers a doctrine about a fated, final, and stoic ekpyrosis. The philosophical paradox here highlights the fact that already in this passage Ovid shows us a Jupiter entirely subordinated to fate. Finally, there is a third passage in the Metamorphoses where Ovid theorizes about the relationship between Jupiter and fate. The speech Jupiter gives to the assembled gods about the rejuvenation of Iolaus and the sudden growth of Caliroe's sons at Metamorphoses 9, 426, 38, number 13 in your handout. This passage has been studied by Luigi Galasso in an excellent article, and I will limit myself here to highlight some of its Virgilian connections. As Barchiesi says, Jupiter's description of the tabularia of fate arrives, quote, just in time, since the poem has had little to say about fate, end of quote. It is true that the Metamorphoses had little to say about fate, but that little is always associated with the role of Jupiter vis-a-vis fate, is always developed in relationship with the Aeneid, especially with Jupiter's prophecy, Book 1, and his intervention in the Council of Book 10, and is also pointedly coherent. Pointedly, that is, in constant and polemic contrast with Virgil's incoherence on this matter. However, especially in the council scene of Book 9, some of Virgil's more problematic approaches to the relationship of Jupiter with fate might also be reproduced or at least hinted at by Ovid. After the miraculous rejuvenation of Iolaus through Hercules and Hebe's intercession, the goddess Themis pronounces a prophetic speech in which she announces, among other things, that the children of Callirhoe are also about to be miraculously transformed into grown-up men, courtesy of Jupiter himself. The other gods are outraged by this news, and each of them would want to be able to rejuvenate their sons. Jupiter intervenes to rebuke the riotous gods and to explain that those miracles can happen only because they are wanted by fate, which is a power stronger than all the other gods, the very Jupiter included. And this is passage number 13 in your handout, Ovid Metamorphoses 9, 426-38. Let's see how Ovid develops here his critical discourse about Jupiter and fate in the Aeneid. Jupiter's address to the seditious gods at Metamorphoses 9, 428-38 clearly recalls Jupiter's addresses to the less literally seditious but still riotous gods at Aeneid 10, 6, 15 and 104, 12. On the other hand, the more general context rather recalls the other fateful passage in Aeneid 10, that is the Hercules-Jupiter scene at 10, 464-73. In both cases, the issue revolves around the possibility of subverting fate as far as regards the destiny of a son of a divinity to be saved from death in the Aeneid, from old age in the Metamorphoses. And in both cases, Jupiter reminds his interlocutor or interlocutors that he himself has suffered a similar tragedy, respectively the death of Sarpedon and the old age of Rhadamanthus and Minos. Ovid once again interprets and corrects Virgil and his view of the relationship Jupiter-fate. In this case, he makes explicit what in the Hercules-Jupiter passage was, as we have seen above, ambiguously expressed. While Homer's Zeus in Iliad 16 was clearly presented as more powerful than fate, which was then possibly to be identified with his own will, for Hera says that he could have been able to save Sarpedon from his fated death, Virgil's Jupiter, though directly echoing the words of Zeus, was ambiguously presented as acquiescing to a fate which was unclear if he could have subverted or not. Why is Jupiter leaving Sarpedon die? We cannot know. No explanation is given for his behavior. Ovid's Jupiter, on the contrary, is very clear and removes all doubts. Me quoque fata regunt, quae si mutare valere, and so on. Also, the intertextuality of the Metamorphoses 9 scene with the Council of the Gods, which opens in Aeneid 10, can be seen as an interpretative and corrective move. In this case, Virgil's Jupiter was also unclear and contradictory as far as regards his relationship with fate. In his first opening speech, he refers to a past prohibition of him, a move which might seem to suggest a power of him stronger than that of fate. Furthermore, the prophecy of the Punic Wars, adveniet justum pugnae, ne arcessit tempus, and so on, there shall come the right time for war, do not hasten it, 11:14, it delivers immediately afterwards, contains no reference to fate as having any role in its historical necessity. His second and final speech, however, closes with a declaration which since antiquity has been seen as hinting at a different conception. 112:13, Rex Jupiter omnibus idem, fata viam invenient. Jupiter is an equal king for everybody. Fate will find their way. Servius Danielis observes, et videtur, it's number 14b on the handout, et videtur hic ostendisse, aliud esse fata, aliud Jovem. And here it seems to show that one thing is fate and another Jupiter. Also, Servius's comment here implies a distinction between Jupiter and fate. Scit enim hoc esse fatale ut Aeneas imperet in Italia. For Jupiter knows that it is fated that Aeneas rules over Italy. Once again, Jupiter is not identified with fate. He is the one who knows fate. Harrison himself, in his note here, refers to Jupiter's, quote, apparent separation of his own powers from those of destiny, end of quote. Ovid removes the contradiction inherent in Virgil's depiction of Jupiter in the Council of the Gods, again resolutely following the Servian approach to the problem, so that once again we might wonder if maybe discussions of the kind presupposed by the Servian commentary were already current at the time of the composition of the Metamorphoses. But let's come back to the other major contradiction aroused by Jupiter's speeches in the Council of Enir 10, that between his reference to the war in Latium as something which he had previously forbidden, as he says at line 610 of Book 10, and what he has said to Venus in Book 1, 293, Bellum ingens geret Italia. According to the most popular critical approach to this issue, which is ultimately inspired by Servius Danielis' note on 10:8, Jupiter is here sort of lying to the other gods. His words to Venus in Book 1 would demonstrate that he fully knows that the war in Latium was fated to happen, or even that he wanted the war to happen. Though the problem is very complicated and probably insoluble, the inconsistency here between Enid 1 and 10 is unmistakable. Now, if there are no inconsistencies in Ovid's depiction of the relationship Jupiter-Fate inside the episode of Book 9 we are considering, Jupiter's speech to the rebellious gods about the rejuvenation of Iolaus and the sudden growth of the sons of Calirrhae, and between this depiction and that which Ovid will give in Book 15, there are perhaps at least some degrees of inconsistency between this episode and what preceded it in Book 9 itself. In his speech to the rebellious gods, Jupiter insists most clearly and most resolutely that the miracles which have outraged them had been decreed by fate. the emphasis Jupiter places on the superiority of fate over all other powers, himself included, betrays the difficulty he encounters in explaining to the other gods that the rejuvenation of Iolaus and the growth of the sons of Callirhoe have happened because of the decrees of fate, since nothing in the previous narrative had even remotely suggested that such was the case. Both the cases which have provoked the indignation of the gods in Metamorphoses 9 have been described as gifts conceded by some god or goddess as the response to someone else's prayers. Iolaus has been rejuvenated by Hebe, conquered by the praise of his husband Hercules, 401. You find the relevant passages at number 15 in your handout. No reason is given for Hebe's request of rejuvenating Iolaus, but we know from Euripides' Heraclide that it had been Iolaus himself who had asked Hebe and Zeus of being young again for one day only in order to seek revenge on his enemy Eurystheus. A very human and apparently scarcely faithful reason. And of course, Iolaus invokes Hebe because she is the wife of his dear friend Hercules. As to the sons of Callirhoe, in Themis' prophecy, it is Jupiter himself who will concede to the suppliant Callirhoe the gifts of his stepdaughter and daughter-in-law, namely of Hebe, that is, will transform her sons into men while they are still in the childhood years. Lines 413, 17, again number 15 in your handout. If the troubled line 415, Neue necem sinat esse diu victoris in ultam, and he will not allow the death of the winner be unavenged, were to be secluded, as in Tarente's text, Themis would not even explain the reason for Callirhoe's rather peculiar request. In any case, we know from other sources that she wanted her sons to avenge the killing of her husband Alcmaeon. Vengeance again. And while Themis does not say anything either about why Jupiter did accede to Callirhoe's request, we know from Pseudo-Apollodorus, 391, that the two were lovers. There is no hint of faith in these divine actions, either in what Ovid says or in what he left implicit and to be reconstructed by the reader's competence. Also in Jupiter's speech to the rebellious gods in Metamorphoses 9, as in that of the god to the equally rebellious gods in Aeneid 10, there is a strong suspicion that he may be not wholly honest in his insistence on the key role of fate in human affairs. Perhaps then Ovid not only interprets Virgil's inconsistencies in matter of fate in order to correct them. His Jupiter is most clearly and explicitly dominated by fate. He also hints at them in order to subtly reproduce them. We have seen above the meta-narrative significance of sola, the word with which Jupiter addresses Venus at the beginning of his speech at Metamorphoses 15:807. The goddess is not alone in wanting to save a son of her from fated death. Jupiter himself had wished to save his son Sarpedon from fated death in Iliad 16. Similar meta-narrative implications are also present in the last words of this first introductory section of Jupiter's speech to his daughter. Metamorphoses 15, 813, 15, and we are back to number 1 in your handout. The importance of etiamnum has been remarked upon by both Barchesi and Hardy. Hardy says, quote, "What follows clearly shows that Jupiter can speak thus because he has read the Aeneid, and he is going to replay for Venus's behalf, who must be a little absent-minded, the prophecy concerning the fate of the Julian line he had already expounded for her in Aeneid 1. I'm sorry, this was Barchesi, not Hardy. Hardy, instead, in his 2015 Valla commentary on book 15 says, Etiamnum might express a surprise that Venus should still be reminded of the future. After all, she herself had brought the prophetic shield to Aeneas. End of quote. The reference to Jupiter's prophecy in Aeneid 1 is of course especially appropriate, since here Ovid is reworking that very scene. This cross-reference to a previous meeting of Jupiter and Venus in the epic tradition is not just a typically Ovidian move, but fits into an already Virgilian pattern of cross-referencing between epic divine dialogues, which Ovid once again both exaggerates and clarifies. A problematic aspect of the passages of the Aeneid dealing with divine assemblies or dialogues is that they constantly refer to a history of divine communications which is difficult or impossible to reconstruct, and not only because of the loss of Nevius's and Ennius's poems. For example, 1. In Book 1, Venus refers to promises that Jupiter had made to her in the past. When and where this happened, we do not know, even if the reader acquainted with Ennius and Nevius was certainly in a better position than what we are in today to recognize this reference. Second, at 4:227-8, Jupiter refers to some unknown episode in which Venus vouched for her son to him. Non illum nobis genetrix pulcherrima talem promissit. It was not such a man as this that his beautiful mother promised us. Third, as we have seen, in the assembly of Book 10, Jupiter refers to some unknown meeting in which he had prohibited the war in Latium. Vagueness and confusion also characterize the foreseeing of future divine communication. At 1:279-82, Jupiter predicts a reconciliation of Juno, but it is not immediately clear when this will happen, and it took Finney's 1984 article, the reconciliations of Juno, to clarify once and for all that this reconciliation is not to be identified with the scene between Jupiter and Juno in Book 12. The references of Virgil's Venus to Jupiter's past promises about the glorious future of the Trojans, Romans at Aeneid 1:234-7 are particularly interesting from the perspective of the Venus-Jupiter scene in Metamorphoses 15. As said above, in all probability here there is cross-referencing between the Aeneid and the epic poems of Nivius and Ennius. In Ennius's annals there are, of course, scanty traces of the Council of the Gods in which the destiny of Romulus was discussed, but we have no knowledge of any private meeting between Jupiter and Venus in that poem. However, as is well known, there was such a meeting in Nivius's Bellum Poenicum, and the Venus-Jupiter scene of Aeneid 1 is allegedly modeled on it. See number 16 in your handout, Macrobius 6-30, fragment 14, Szelesky of Nivius's Bellum Poenicum, totus hic locus, that is the storm and the Venus-Jupiter meeting in Aeneid 1, totus sumptus anaevio est ex primo libro belli punici, illic enim aeque Venus Troianis tempestate laborantibus cum Jove queritur, et secuntur verba Jovis filiam consolantis spe futurorum. All this passage is derived from the first book of Nevius's Bellum Poenicum, for there too Venus complains to Jupiter while the Trojans are tossed by a tempest, and there follow Jupiter's words consoling his daughter with the hope of future things. It is probable that while consoling Venus with the hope of future things, Jupiter gave her those books of the future that we know from another source the goddess gave in her toll to Anchises, number 17, fragment 9, Szelesky, Naevius enim dicit, venerem libros futura continentes Anchisae dedisse. For Nivius says that Venus had given to Anchises books containing the future. This is a further reason to see a reference to the unrolling of a scroll of Fata at Aeneid 1:262, longius et volvens fatorum arcana movebo, and raises further complications in Ovid's depiction of Jupiter consulting the tabularia of the Parcae. Is Ovid returning to Nivius's version of the dialogue between Venus and Jupiter? That is, in other words, was Nivius's Jupiter really just a simple reader of books of fate written by other powers, or were those books his own work? We cannot know, but what is certain is that there is a book of fate-related thread which connects the three Venus-Jupiter scenes of Nivius, Virgil, and Ovid. In the Metamorphoses, Ovid repeatedly plays upon the Virgilian difficulties concerning the cross-references between past and present divine meetings, both exaggerating and clarifying them. Morse's famous quotation of the words of Ennius's Jupiter at Metamorphoses 14:814, which repeats a line which is identical with in Ennius Annals 454 Scuch, famously discussed by Conte in his Memoria dei Poeti, is to be seen in such terms, and as an exaggeration of a Virgilian tendency to refer to past promises and past assemblies which is not very clear when happened. Ovid instead is once again very clear. Furthermore, in occasion of the apotheosis of Aeneas, Ovid ironically multiplies the reconciliations of Juno, this in Metamorphoses 14, 581-2 and 592-3, as a comment on the plurality of Juno's reconciliations in the Aeneid and the epic tradition. On the other side, in contrast with the remarkable memory of Mars in the later scene of the apotheosis of Romulus, and in striking contrast with the Virgilian tendency to make references to past promises and previous encounters, both Venus and Juno are presented as completely forgetful of Jupiter's promises of immortality for Aeneas in the Aeneid. Venus's forgetfulness resurfaces here in Metamorphoses 15 in occasion of her dialogue with Jupiter. After all, Venus's forgetfulness has been literally evoked by the goddess herself in the speech she gives to every god she encounters at 765-78. Quid nunc antiqua recordor damna me generis, timoric meminisse priorum non sinit. Why do I remember now the ancient sufferings of my descendants? This present fear does not allow me to remember the past. On the other side, we must bear in mind two further complications. First, in his prophecy in Aeneid 1, Jupiter has said nothing about the circumstances of the death of Julius Caesar, so Venus has at least some justification in her worrying about a homicidal conspiracy she is looking at. Above all, second, in that prophecy, it is also famously unclear whether Jupiter is referring to Caesar or to Augustus when he speaks of the Trojanus Caesar, a Iulius descendant of Iulus, whose power will end with the ocean and fame with the stars, and whom Venus will one day welcome in the sky as a god. It is not easy to discern what exactly Ovid is doing with this Virgilian ambiguity. Surely, he once again clarifies. In the prophecy of Ovid's Jupiter, where both rulers are mentioned, it is very clear what refers to whom, what to Caesar and what to Augustus, and already this might be clarification enough. Hardy, however, is probably right when he says that Ovid is primarily interested in supporting an identification of the Trojanus Caesar with Julius Caesar rather than with Augustus. Quote, when Jupiter ends his speech by instructing Venus to transform Julius into a god, there might be implicit a reading of the Caesar of Aeneid 1 286-90 as Julius rather than Augustus. Where Virgil is obscure and ambiguous, Ovid corrects him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Casali, for this wonderful lecture. We can now proceed to the discussion and questions. Entonces, bueno, no sé quién quiera comenzar participando con alguna pregunta, con algún comentario. Si quieren, pueden alzar su mano para